Well, now that we have talked about one-dimensional energy band diagrams for conduction band and valence band edges in a semiconductor, let's move on to 3 dimensions. Pictured here is, I think, the simplest unit cell of a crystal, which is cubic in structure. So you have an atom at each corner of the cube. The atoms are a distance 2a apart. So 2a is what you would call the lattice constant. And this is configuration space. That means x, y, z space. And so x, y, and z, sort of standard right-hand rule definitions. And you can have more complex cubic structures, such as body-centered cubic, where there is an atom at the center of the cube, or face-centered cubic, where atoms are located on the centers of the 6 faces. Or it doesn't even have to be cubic. It can be orthorhombic, which would require these length, width, and heights to be different. But we will stick with cubic for the purpose of all of our illustrations here. A cube in configuration space, that means XYZ space, is the Fourier transform of a structure in K space. And so we should really look in K space, where K is the Fourier transform conjugate of x, y, and z, K sub x, K sub y, and K sub z. These K's are 2 pi over x, y, and z, and so the corners of a Fourier transformed object are at minus 2 pi over a and plus 2 pi over a in our cube. You might recall that K, wave number, is 2 pi divided by wavelength, 2 pi over length. This is referred to as reciprocal lattice space. And we're going to look at a cube in reciprocal lattice space instead of a cube in configuration space. And the smallest cubic structure available in reciprocal lattice space is referred to as the first Brillouin zone. These corners of the cube, 2 pi over a, are the crystal momentum. That is the K value, the wave number that an electron would have if its wavelength matched the crystal lattice. Fourier transforms work in both directions. So they're the Fourier transform of each other. In reciprocal lattice space, you have the first Brillouin zone, and in configuration space, you have the unit cell, and they're Fourier transforms of the 2 spaces. The unit cell is the smallest unit you can carve a crystal into and maintain its periodicity. You can also call reciprocal lattice space momentum space, remembering that momentum P is just h bar times the wave number K. That's literally momentum space. That's the same thing, just off by a factor of h bar. Now this is something that we're going to have to keep in mind, is that momentum is a vector, wave number is a vector. They're the same direction, just offset by a factor of h bar. So if you are going in one direction, you have a certain momentum vector. If you're going in another direction, you have a different momentum vector, and that's going to affect how we do band structure diagrams. The K vector points in the direction that a wave propagates. So if the electron is moving in the x direction, the K vector points in its x direction, the K sub x direction actually. If the electron happens to be heading 30 degrees west of north, then the K vector is pointing 30 degrees west of north. You'll see some symmetry notation in these cubes. For example, the capital K, not to be confused with the wave numbers, refers to a point in reciprocal lattice space that's at the edge of the Brillouin zone. We have other points of high symmetry. The highest symmetry point is capital gamma. That is the dead center of the cell, both in configuration space and in reciprocal lattice space. That's better summarized here. Capital gamma is used for the center of the first Brillouin zone. Capital delta, L, X, and W are used for the various faces of the first Brillouin zone. Yes, there are 6 faces and there are 4 letters available. We just never seem to need more than 4. Capital K then refers to an edge of the Brillouin zone as shown here. So these are the points of high symmetry that are going to show up on the band structure diagrams that I'll be showing you shortly here. There's one other point I want to make first, and that has to do with translation in configuration space and reciprocal lattice space. If I have an electron, say at this bottom left corner, it can move over to the bottom right corner, and that's a translation which is fairly easy to grasp. I could take my magic electron tweezers and pick up the electron from this corner and move it to that corner. It's a simple translation. If an electron is at the bottom left corner of the cube in reciprocal lattice space and it moves to the bottom right corner, that's not a translation, that's a change of momentum. And so for an electron to relocate anywhere in reciprocal lattice space, its momentum has to change. The only way a reciprocal lattice space coordinate changes is if there is an impulse delivered to the wave to change the direction of its propagation vector. And that impulse is going to be really important when we start doing optoelectronics, because we'll have to look at how a photon can or cannot deliver enough impulse to an electron to change its momentum so that it can jump across the band gap. Yes, with each point in reciprocal lattice space corresponding to a different momentum, the only way to move an electron or a wave in reciprocal lattice space is to transfer momentum to it. Now let's look at some band diagrams. So I mentioned that we have zero-dimensional band diagrams. We can have one-dimensional band diagrams where the horizontal direction corresponds to a translation through the semiconductor. And we can have three-dimensional energy band diagrams, which are done in K-space. Here is a zero-dimensional band diagram for germanium, showing the valence band and the conduction band. Any electrons with energy higher than the conduction band edge are in the conduction band and they're mobile. Any electrons with energy lower than the valence band edge are in the valence band and they're not mobile. And the two band edges are separated by 0.67 electron volts, which is the band gap for germanium. That's a zero-dimensional energy band diagram, meaning the horizontal axis is meaningless. It could be a one-dimensional band diagram just by saying so. In other words, by saying that the horizontal axis is positioned, so as I go across a semiconductor. That allows us to have the band edges change level at some point, for example, at a junction. Let's look at some three-dimensional band diagrams. What distinguishes three-dimensional band diagrams from zero and one-dimensional is that the horizontal axis is in K-space. So these are high symmetry points in the reciprocal lattice. That's the main distinction, besides the fact that it being three dimensions means that each point on the horizontal axis could be in a different direction. This is our way of translating three dimensions onto a two-dimensional graph. We have silicon on the left, and we have the band diagram for gallium arsenide on the right. Now let's talk about the curves that we see in here. You see this dark gray region, and there's not a whole lot passing through it. These curves above it and below it are band edges. Let's look above it first. This curve that I'm following with the cursor looks to be the lowest conduction band edge. Yes, there are multiple conduction bands in a crystal. And now it's no longer the lowest conduction band edge. Another one is taken over at this point. But there's always some conduction band edge that is the lowest, and that's the one that really matters. And then there are higher conduction bands, but they really won't affect our treatment of carrier conduction in a semiconductor. Below the band gap are the valence band edges, and yes, there are multiple valence bands. In this case, they all have some sort of relevance, but I'll follow one valence band across the whole reciprocal lattice, and it's the same valence band. We didn't have something like what happened here where we jumped bands. And then there's another valence band, and you'll notice that the two valence bands have a maximum energy value at the same point, which happens to be the gamma point. That's not just common, that's the way it always seems to work out for these band diagrams. The lowest point of the conduction band edges may or may not be at the same point. And let's look at gallium arsenide and see how that little observation can be made differently. I'm only going to show you one valence band edge and one conduction band edge just to keep things simple. So if I follow the conduction band edge with the cursor here, I find a point where it's a minimum. It's the gamma point of the reciprocal lattice, and I follow the valence band edge, and where it's a maximum, as usual, it's the gamma point of the reciprocal lattice. They're the same points. With silicon, the conduction band has its lowest point at a different spot in the reciprocal lattice than the valence band has its maximum point. Those are two different kinds of band structures. Silicon is referred to as an indirect gap because the valence band maximum is at a different point than the conduction band minimum. Gallium arsenide is referred to as a direct band gap because the two band edges have their extrema at the same place. And you'll notice that the valence band edges tend to be concave down, and the conduction band edges tend to be concave up. Those clearly aren't absolute rules, but that's a tendency. And you'll go deep into the valence band and you'll find an edge that is just completely concave up. But we really don't care about this particular valence band because it is so far away from where the action is. It won't affect the carrier concentration or carrier motion in a semiconductor. And the highest point in the valence band edge, whether it's in gallium arsenide, silicon, or anything else, is arbitrarily called the zero of energy. You notice that's where it reads zero. Of course, the energy being potential energy, that is rather arbitrary, but that's where we always put the zero. So for silicon, you can look it up in table 1-1 of Hu's textbook and see that it has a band gap of 1.12 electron volts, and that's in fact the thickness of this gray area here. And gallium arsenide has a band gap of 1.42 electron volts, and sure enough, that's how far up it is to here. This is a nice little applet on Wikipedia for several different materials: indium arsenide, silicon, gallium arsenide, germanium. The first conduction band edge is shown. The top three valence band edges are shown. Valence bands do get treated a little bit differently because we have to average the effective masses that electrons have in the different bands together. And so we always account for them. And I'll describe them in a second here. Just take a look at germanium there. See that point in germanium? If you see this point in germanium right here, where it seems to have a sudden discontinuity, that's two conduction bands crossing over. The lowest energy conduction band is always taken as the dominant one. It's the one that matters. And so that point right there is where movement to a new conduction band happens. With the valence bands, you'll notice that there are always three shown here. And they all have an importance, a significance. They don't overlap, although they may appear to be right on top of each other. And they have names: the light hole band, the next one the heavy hole band, and the bottom one being the spin split off band, which is a neat quantum mechanical effect involving spin-orbit coupling. So you notice with gallium arsenide, and all of them except silicon actually, they're direct band gap semiconductors. That is, the valence band has its maximum and the conduction band has its minimum at the same position in K space. Using that information for gallium arsenide, and the fact that its band gap is 1.42 electron volts, let's answer the question of what is the longest wavelength of light that promotes a valence electron into the conduction band. Now you can have a very high energy photon come along and it's able to promote an electron from deep in the valence band to deep into the conduction band, but the minimum energy or the longest wavelength photon, those are the same thing, that will allow the transition to occur must have an energy of 1.42 electron volts. So we can calculate the corresponding wavelength simply from energy as hc over lambda. So the 1.42 electron volts, the smallest energy photon that works for this, is hc over its lambda, where hc is 1240 electron volt nanometers. And if you use that, then you get lambda wavelength in nanometers. You get 873 nanometers. That's infrared. Any shorter wavelength also can promote an electron up into the conduction band. However, we do have a homework problem coming up where we find that the occupation of states congregates around the band edges. And so most of the carriers available for promotion are near the band edge. So what we really find is that we have a small range of wavelengths around 873 nanometers that effectively promotes electrons into the conduction band. That was gallium arsenide. It's less straightforward with silicon because silicon is an indirect band gap semiconductor. That means if you want to get an electron to go from the valence band into the conduction band, you not only need to give it energy, you have to change its momentum. The problem is that a photon doesn't carry a lot of momentum with it. It carries some momentum, but not a lot. Typically not enough. Let's look at the band structure for silicon. So the electron has to jump from the valence band to the conduction band, and in doing so, it also has to change its momentum. It has to change the direction of its k-vector. That requires impulse, and a lot of impulse, and a photon just doesn't have that much impulse. And so we're going to take a close look at that when we get to optoelectronics to see what tricks are used to make silicon still work as a photovoltaic. There are some tricks involved, and we'll take a look at some of those when we get there.